We now have a little experience in the user and enable mode of the iOS devices. In this next exercise, we will briefly use the config mode. Let's first create the basic network like we did in Task01. So we first select network devices, switches, then the 2960 switch. This is dragged onto the workspace. To select the laptop, we click on End Devices, then drag the laptop onto the workspace as well. We choose Connections, Rollover or Console Cable. Clicking on the switch, we choose the console port using the RJ45 end. We then click on the laptop and select the RS232 or serial port. We enter the terminal on the PC laptop by double-clicking on the laptop. Then on the desktop tab, then Terminal. Clicking on OK to accept the terminal configuration. Now we press Enter to get started. We said in the last task that if we want to configure a device, then we should be in the configuration mode. To do this, we first have to be in the enable mode. So to start, we use the command enable. Once again, we know we are in the enable mode because of the prompt. To enter the config mode now, we use config. A message will be displayed configuring from the terminal, memory or network. Pressing enter will accept the first option, terminal. Once again, the prompt will change. The reason we see this message is that it is possible to load configuration files from another location. By selecting terminal, we have chosen to enter it manually. The first thing we shall do is rename the switch. So we enter the command hostname SW1. Notice now the prompt has changed again. We can actually continue to enter different configuration commands as one long batch. This is useful as it allows long complicated configurations to be scripted and entered in one go, rather than a series of small commands. However, in this example, we have only changed the host name of this device. Notice this message. If we hold down the Control key and press the Z key once, we should find we have returned to the Enable mode and no longer in the configuration mode. In the last task, we looked at the basics of accessing the switch and some of the ways we can navigate using the CLI. You may have noticed that at no point were we asked for any login credentials, passwords or met with any kind of security checks when accessing the switch. In some cases, a switch may be left this way as traditionally it is physically separated from the main network in a locked room or cabinet. However, we may want to apply some basic security to the device in case it is ever exposed and someone has access to a rollover cable. Remember that there are also different ways of accessing the switch, including Telnet and SSH. However, since this requires an IP address to be set up, we will deal with these later and for now apply some security for those entering via the console cable. It must be stressed at this point that the security used here is only very basic. A determined intruder would still be able to physically steal the switch and run through the reset routines to gain access. However, at least this switch will have some protection enabled. When accessing the switch via the console cable, there are 2 points where we may wish to protect the device. First, it may be to add security at the point of entry, so a password is needed as soon as someone makes the terminal connection. And secondly, we may wish to restrict the enable command by using a password requirement. Of course, this in turn then prevents unauthorized access to the config mode also. We can choose either or both of these methods of security. First, we can check the current configuration of this device using the command show running config. As this shows the entire configuration of the device, the output is quite lengthy. However, on this first page we can see the host name is now SW1. And a little further up there is a notice which states no service password encryption has been set. There are actually 2 ways of doing this. Here we shall look at both. By pressing any key other than the space or enter, the listing is aborted. What we shall do is add a password to the enable mode to restrict the user. So if they attempt to enter the enable mode, they will need a password. To do this, we must first be in the configuration mode, so we use the command config. Press enter will select the terminal. The command to add a password is enable password, then the password we wish to select. In our example it is let me in. Before we use the control and the Z key to exit the configuration mode. This time we shall use the command exit, then press enter. To return to the user mode, we shall use the command disable. Now when we try and select the enable mode, we are prompted for the password. If we enter a random characters but not the password, then enter, the first thing you'll notice is, as you type, there is no text appearing on the screen. So if a prying eye was to see what you were doing, they would not have any idea what password or how long it was. Here we have attempted it wrong 3 times and an error message has appeared. Bad secrets. This time the correct password was entered. We have now switched to the enable mode, but there is a problem using this password method. We can see this if we use the command show running config. Remember, this is the current configuration of the device. Notice that the enable password is listed in this file, let me in. We could have a situation where as an administrator we have entered the configuration mode and our attention has been diverted elsewhere. It would then be possible for somebody to run the command show run config and discover the password. The alternative method is better from this perspective, as it adds MD5 encryption to the password. We first need to return to the enable mode by pressing any key. Next, to enter the configuration mode using config. Press enter again for terminal. This time, instead of using enable password, we shall use the command enable secret. Then use let me in too as the password. Leave the configuration mode using exit, then press enter again, then disable to return to the user mode. Now to test the new password and see if there has been any change to the running in config file. First we enter the enable mode using enable. Now we enter the new password, let me in too. Then the running config file using show running in config. We can see here that the password has been encrypted. Here we have pressed any key to return to the enable mode. Now that we have added some security to the enable mode, we will add the requirement for a password when someone attempts to access this device from the console. Once again we shall enter the configuration mode using config. We now need to select the console port line. To do this we use the command line console 0. Notice the prompt has changed to indicate that any command now applies to the line, the console access port. We shall use the command password let me in 3. Then the command login. Then we type end to move back to the enable mode, then press enter again. To log out we use the command log out. When the message press return to get started appears, we press enter and a further message will appear, user access verification, and you will be prompted to enter a password. If we now type in let me in 3, we shall have gained access. There is a further problem here which we can see if we reboot the switch. First we need to enter the enable mode using enable, then the password let me in 2. To reboot we used the command reload, and when prompted with proceed with reload we press the enter key and the session will restart. First notice no password is required. Also notice the switch hostname has returned to the default of switch. If we try entering the enable mode using the command enable, we are not challenged to enter any password. This is a very important point to remember. Unless told otherwise, an iOS device will reload the factory default startup config each time it restarts or loses power, meaning all the configuration changes to that point is lost. In order to make changes permanent, we must remember to save the running in config, otherwise it will be reconfigured each time it loads. So let's rename the switch back to SW1. First, the enable command using enable, then config. Use the command hostname SW1. Exit, then press enter. Here we shall copy the running in config to a file called startup config using the command copy running config startup config. The following message will appear: destination file name, startup config. We just press enter to confirm. Now to reboot the switch using the command reload. Notice the hostname of SW1 has remained, and so if we had also changed any other configuration, they too would have been saved. Save as Task02.